Hello, everyone. My name is Monica Kretschmer, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Universal Women's Network, Woman of Inspiration Awards, and this is the Woman of Inspiration podcast, where we talk with women who are leading by example, ignoring the naysayers, and making an impact locally, nationally, and globally. Today is a very special guest. I'm super excited to be having Cynthia Hamilton Urquhart on our podcast today. Cynthia, you are a 2019 Woman of Inspiration Unsung Hero. So it's been a full year and you're part of our alumni. You're now part of our 100 Woman of Inspiration book for that is releasing in 2021. This year has been one of the biggest years for you since Woman of Inspiration Awards. So I'm going to jump right in here. I usually invite our guests and interview and open with, and she's the founder and CDO of blah, and you have NA. And I said, we got to talk about that. Why is it NA? Cynthia has 25 years under her belt as a retired RCMP officer. And you have built your whole entire career of, in the public service industry. And so I was looking at the title going, Cynthia, NA, we got to talk about that. Because you are so much, your role is so big and your voice is so strong and you have so many great things to share with our listeners today. So welcome, Cynthia, and we're going to just jump right in. NA, let's talk about that.
Thank you. Well, it's awesome to be here, Monica. And NA, what is your title? I looked at it and said, well, I don't have a title, so it's not applicable, plain and simple. And then
let's talk about how so now it's not applicable for your new role because it's big and it's growing. And I really wanted not to embarrass you about that today because I just got a great big laugh when we talked about that in the green room. And I said, can I share that, please? Because I think that there's a reason that we do need to talk about it. It's because when we're going through a transition and we're stepping into new uncharted territories, we're not always certain as to what that new role is, how to describe who we are and put a voice and a name to that new chapter in our life. So Cynthia, thank you for entertaining me by talking about this today because it's really important, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a really valid point. I never considered looking at it from that perspective. I have a very defined viewpoint of what my role was, which was as a member of the RCMP, and my title was corporal when I left, and that defined who I was. So now that I no longer have those boundaries around it, I'm floundering. I've stepped outside of my comfort zone where everything was very well defined for me. And when I'm filling in forms and people ask for title or, I look at these and I go, well, this isn't applicable. And I do have, if I'm very honest, I acknowledge that in that moment, I feel like, well, maybe I'm not worthy. Maybe this isn't for me. These women have done so much more because they have a title. Again, I never really thought about it. So it's a very valid point. And you're right. I'm floundering with that. What do I call myself? Because it was very simple before, and now it isn't.
Very, very great point. And I think that so relatable is that I don't believe that a job title actually does define who you are. And this is a conversation that I've had with many of the women of inspiration, whether it's been, before the awards, after the awards, during the whole process, as women are changing, even roles and responsibilities are changing companies, which changes their title. When they're going through the nomination process, I had people going, but I was a CEO for this organization. Can I still complete my nomination package? I'm starting in a new role in this company. I said, hold on, stop it. Stop right there. You are you. It doesn't matter what your role is or with company. You take your entire package, your knowledge that you have, and that's who you are, right? That's who you bring to the table. So we'll come back to that because your title or your role right now is super powerful. I think you just say Cynthia Hamilton Urquhart, super powerful. Wonder Woman. That would be a great role, a title for you as well, because you have really quite an inspirational story. I want to start into, what led you into the role of public service? What sparked your interest into a career with the RCMP?
Yeah, it actually goes back to my childhood. My parents adopted my brother and myself. We're not biologically related, but my brother ended up having a very rare genetic disorder. And with that, he ended up losing his eyesight by the time he was 9 years old. He also had a learning disability and he looked different. So I found out what the reality of the world is like very early on, when kids would pick on him and make fun of him. And I realized that it was my role to protect him, and even though he was 2 years older than me. So I had a particular incident where we were walking home from school one day, and one of the older kids from the school started making fun of my brother. And I was 6 years old at the time, and I was very upset. He came up to us, and I had an umbrella in my hand. And so I started beating him. He was probably 10 years old with the umbrella, and bent my umbrella, but he left us alone and I walked back home. And, so I think that from that point forward, I recognized from watching my parents, and I had an older sister, 17 years older, who was my parents' biological daughter. And everybody was about treating people fairly and how the world could be a difficult place at times. And I saw that on a daily basis. I saw people staring at my brother, people making fun of him. He didn't fit into the school system, and ended up going to a school for the blind. So the unfairness of life was just something I saw. And I actually thought I was going to be a nurse, and my older sister was a nurse. But what happened was, when I was in high school, just different courses that I took didn't match up to what I needed. But in the interim, when I went into university, I actually went into sociology and had the opportunity to do a couple of ride-alongs with the local police force. Went to a juvenile detention center, which is what they were called back then, and really saw how people were struggling. These kids were in this institution and they needed love and care. And so I really recognized how policing could make a difference, and decided to take that path instead.
So very interesting. Now let's go back, like 25 years.
Mhm.
And, that is still, we talk about industries that are underrepresented by women. And that
Mhm.
certainly was the case 25 years ago. Am I correct? Like, did you have a bunch of women in the class going through that training with you? Or were you the only woman in the room at that time?
Well, I think the thing that's interesting that I probably should mention is that the reason I considered the RCMP, even though women had only been in for 11 years when I joined, my parents were very forward thinking, even though my father was born in 1919 and my mother in 1923. And for the era that they came from, you would have expected them to have those very well-defined traditional roles, but they didn't. My parents, men and women, could do anything. My mother was very independent, and if she wanted to do something, she just did it. So when I joined the RCMP, I was actually ignorant to how much non-traditional roles were still an issue for women. And I'm not sure I'm wording that appropriately, but so when I joined, I never really thought anything about it. Now, because women had been in for 11 years, we had a troop of 32 women. There were actually quite a few women going through at that time. But again, percentage-wise for the whole country, we were still not that common. We didn't have any female instructors in those days. A lot of us were sent out to detachments where there were no other women. And so we were still breaking those barriers for sure. Our red surge, that most people, and I should say RCMP, I should say Royal Canadian Mounted Police, because depending on who's listening to this, not everybody knows who the RCMP is. with our Stetson and boots and breeches. We didn't have that in our day. We had a pillbox hat, a polyester turtleneck, a skirt with pumps, pantyhose, and we actually carried our revolver and our handcuffs in a purse. So this was our formal red surge, not in our day-to-day working uniform. But yeah, so we didn't have the bulletproof vests weren't issues back in those days. We didn't fall under occupational health and safety when I joined. So there was a lot of things that were still very, very new in the organization.
Okay, I'm still getting this image of you carrying a purse with your pistol and your handcuffs in it and going, so did men also wear a purse? Did they also have a purse? Where did they carry theirs?
Yeah, it was 1989 when they actually changed the uniform requirements, and women were at that point allowed to wear the traditional red serge that the men wore. So yes, it was very different.
So what were some of those challenges that you did face, and I'm sure that it's very consistent with breaking through barriers in a lot of industries where you're having women, because I mean, there's a different washroom that we go into, and what were some of those barriers? Maybe I'll just let you chat about that.
Yeah. Once I was out in the field, yeah, there certainly were lots of barriers, and there were lots of things that were easy to deal with because women had been in the role for 11 years. And for those women, I can only imagine the ones in those first troops, the difficulties that they had. But it would be something, I had a detachment that I worked at where, so in the RCMP, we worked on our own quite a bit. And I'm talking right now about rural policing. And with the shifts, we were not permitted to work with just another female. So there had to be a male on shift with us. And some of the people who were putting together the shift schedules would get upset with the women because they said that there's no way we can just let two women work, in two different areas. And again, that was their perception of it. There was no written rule that said that. That's just how they perceived it, even though we had gone through the same training and everything was the same. Back in those days when we got pregnant, and we were off for pregnancy, the men had to carry our workload. So nobody came in to take our place. So you tended to feel guilty once you became pregnant, or you would try to hide the pregnancy so that you could work as long as possible and not impact your coworkers. And, having people call the office and ask to speak to a police officer. And I'm like, well, you are. And like, no, I'm looking for the real ones, the men. And when I worked on Parliament Hill for a period of time in Ottawa, and a lot of that was red surge duty. So I was wearing the pillbox hat and that. So when the tourists from all over the world would come, they thought I was a meter maid. And when I informed them differently and said, no, I'm a Mountie, and they were like, well, again, no, we're looking for the real ones, the men. But I have to say, so there certainly were lots of hurdles, but I had lots of wonderful men that treated us equal. We were trained the same. And it wasn't, if somebody was assigning a task, they would say, okay, we need 5 members. It wasn't, oh, we have to make sure we have at least a guy on the shift. They were wonderful. And so it went both ways.
So what were some of the barriers as far as, progressing in your career? Was it easy to do that? Or, were there, let's talk about that progression, that pipeline that you aspired to be in a larger leadership role within the organization. How easy was that for you?
Well, back in those days, and I joined in 1985, certainly we didn't have the women leaders that we have today. Unfortunately, I don't remember when women started moving into leadership positions, but it went, at my point when I joined, we didn't even have any female instructors. So you had nobody to I guess, mentoring us in terms of what it was going to be like as a female working in a non-traditional career. And I think one of the biggest things I realized was recognizing that I would be treated differently because I was female, coming from a family where that was not how we worked. And it became apparent rather quickly that that was actually an issue. And so I probably spent the first 10 years of my career trying to be one of the guys until one day I realized, well, why can't I just be me? You know, I'm not, I just police differently. You know, women, we bring something to the table that is different than men. It's not better, it's not worse, it's different. And that's why having women in policing and men is so important. And that was a big lesson for me, to realize, hey, I don't need to worry so much about fitting in. It's about just be me, and let the strengths of who I am become what I'm known for in my policing. And that's what, but it takes a while. I was 22 years old. So I was just a kid.
Mhm. So what are some of your biggest lessons that you learned throughout your whole career? If you could, pinpoint some of those biggest lessons that you take into your leadership as your NA
Mm,
for your next journey and part of your
yeah.
career, what would you say those lessons are?
I think is allowing yourself to be who you are. Just be true to yourself. Don't try to fit somebody else's mold. And so I've adopted a line for myself, which is dare to be different. And no matter what you're doing, stop comparing. And I think that took up so much of my career. Well, what is someone else doing, or how are they doing it, or what are other people going to think? Where here I am now, in this stage in my life, going, hey, you know what? This is me. This is how I do things. I always self-reflect, and there's a difference between self-reflection and comparing yourself to what other people are doing. So for anyone, I think it's don't be afraid to step outside your comfort zone. Don't be afraid to be who you are and be true to yourself. And don't be afraid to reach out to all the other people around you that have so much to give. Yes, there's people that want to be negative or feel threatened by you, or maybe don't want to connect with you, but it just means that you don't want to be with them either. But there's so much and so many people out there that really are willing to share their experience. And asking for help is not a sign of weakness, which I think our society looks at it that way, and recognize that it's actually a sign of strength and courage when you can say, hey, I don't have this, I need support. So, and I learned that in my mental health journey as well.
So let's talk about that next, because asking for help is something that everybody can relate to. I don't know there's
Yes.
one person, an
Mhm.
entrepreneur, a business owner, a professional, whatever, a person, man or woman, that hasn't had to ask for help. And until you realize that that's a strength, not a weakness,
Mhm.
it's a hard journey. It's hard to learn that. So let's talk about asking for help. What and PTSD. When did you know? You've certainly experienced a lot during your career, but when did it really come to a head that you were struggling with PTSD, or even that you knew that you had PTSD?
Yeah, it's a really interesting journey that I had, and just so that your listeners understand, is that my husband was also an RCMP member, and he served for 35 years. So we have the two of us in our household with first responder careers, and I needed to tell you that because it's part of my story. But basically, what happened is when I first back in 2008, I was transferred to our training academy where I was going to be teaching. And on my first day at work, I had a complete breakdown. So I didn't know anyone yet. This was a new area for me. And I was being shown the different manuals that we were going to have to teach the cadets in the training program. And I think there was 15 manuals, and they were thick manuals. I had just been transferred from Ottawa, where I had only been for 8 months. That would be my husband and I and our two youngest children, Prior to that, I had been in St. John's, Newfoundland for 18 months. Prior to that, I had been in New Brunswick. So there was a lot piling up. And on this particular day, my body just said, you can't do this. So I was put off for 3 months. This is still back at a time that PTSD was not really talked about. It wasn't in a lot of the mental health conversations at that time. So I had some therapy, and we basically figured out that I was tired, exhausted. And do you know what, to be very honest, my way of dealing with difficult emotions was to shelve them, to be dealt with later when it was convenient. But convenient never came. So they just kept piling up and piling up. And I learned that as a small child, and it continued that way. So I had this big moment, but 12 weeks after that, I went back to work and felt like I was much better. But then 6 months later, I got some devastating news that I needed open heart surgery. So I was right back into crisis mode. Again, I shelved everything with that, hid everything. So long story, we fast forward, and I'm sorry if this is confusing people, because there's a lot of parts, there's a lot of cogs in this wheel, is that my husband was diagnosed with PTSD first, and actually complex PTSD. And the difference between the two, PTSD typically is because of a one-time incident. Something's gone on and you have this reaction to it. Complex PTSD tends to be repetitive, so it's over years. So you may have a sexual assault victim, first responders who see trauma day after day after day. So he was diagnosed with it. Now with PTSD, I think everybody has their own version of what they think it's supposed to look like. A lot of that has to do with our Hollywood version of PTSD, which tends to be the military person who was in a war, who struggled and saw something traumatic, or something traumatic happened to them, and then they end up homeless on the street. It's just this version of what it is, and it really shows our lack of education. So my husband was diagnosed with PTSD. I had no issue accepting that. His career was longer than mine. He had certainly worked in some areas that were much more violent than mine. I dealt with violence, but he had more. So my husband actually tricked me into a counseling session. And it's not because what the problem was that how do you know you're struggling if you don't even know what you're supposed to be looking for? And anyway, my issue was I had dealt with a very difficult death of a small child years earlier in my service. And I couldn't get that vision out of my head. And every morning when I woke up for 14 years, she was there, and I didn't know that wasn't normal. And that is where the journey started. And once I was able to get my head around it, I denied it, and I denied it because I was female. I thought women don't get PTSD. Well, I don't live on the street. I'm high functioning. How is this possible? So I had that same vision of what I thought PTSD was as well back, and this was back in 2013, 2012. So the lack of education in general for the public about what PTSD is, and to be very honest, PTSD is different for everybody, and it looks different and it feels different, and their journey with it will be very different. Once I was able to understand that a lot of the things I was feeling, so the visions, fatigue, I couldn't make a decision about basic things, even what to have for supper, then I started to recognize that I needed to deal with a lot of the things that have gone on in my life. And that's where it started. So it wasn't just a simple one day boom, oh, you have PTSD. It was a journey. And a lot of the symptoms of PTSD can be explained away by other things.
So the things that you kept putting on the shelf, let's talk about the things that you kept putting on the shelf. What were some of those things?
So they started in my personal life, which we all have things we put on the shelf that we don't want to deal with. We don't want to deal with, or we don't know how to deal with them. So therefore they sit. So in my early childhood, dealing with my brother was very traumatic to see the different things that went on with him, and having him sent away from school. When I was 14 years old, walking home from school, I was attacked. When I was a 20-year-old young woman, I was sexually assaulted on a couple of occasions, and those all piled on. My mother died when I was 20 years old. That piled on the shelf, and it just kept continuing, so that um, I didn't even realize that I had a lot of things that I should have been dealing with prior to that. But again, you go back in those times, you didn't talk about difficult topics. It just wasn't something that was done. So even when I went into policing, my bucket was already carrying a lot. So then when you start to add the traumas that first responders deal with on top of that, then that is where you get to a point where we're still human, and there's only so much that people can deal with before you really need to start managing it. And so that's basically it was life, and it was some really difficult things in life that I had never dealt with. I hadn't even acknowledged that I was a victim. And a lot of those things, when I was in policing, I really did focus a lot on women who were victims of domestic abuse and sexual assault, and child abuse. So that triggered an awful lot of things for me in my own world as well. But it is very common for people to have traumas. That's just part of the human condition.
Mm. So what's really interesting is you're in this public service role and you're first responder. And you never really know what you're walking into. How did you cope going through those scenarios? You've identified that you had PTSD. Were you removed from the front line while you dealt with it, or did you deal with working through PTSD while you're still frontline? What was that
How did that
process?
work? It's a very valid question. In my case, I wasn't diagnosed till 2 years after I retired. So the skill set that I had to just remove myself from the emotional side, and it's what there's a place to be able to put your emotions aside so that we can do our job, and we have to be able to do that. People are looking to us for leadership. They're looking to us for support, and those things. So it is a skill set that you need if you're going to be able to cope with the job. What we don't take into account, and historically our professions have not valued mental health. We haven't talked about it. I'm not even sure I did, because I didn't know any better historically. But what we now know is that when we do go through traumatic incidents, even as first responders, we need to grieve. We need the grieving rituals. We need to be able to go through those processes, so that we can move on and be healthy, to be able to continue to do our job in the best way we can, and to be able to contribute to our family units in the same way that we should be able to. So for the members that are still working and struggling with this, it's a lot to deal with, because the conversations are out there, but we have a long way to go. It's great to have, we have Bell Let's Talk Day. It's wonderful, and everybody focuses on mental health, but where are we the day after, right? We all go back to our businesses and life continues on. And I think what they're doing is wonderful, and it's a great initiative, but I believe that mental health care is a right. It shouldn't be an option. And I think with our first responders, most first responders are stretched to the max. We don't have enough people. And when you're trying to provide support to someone who's still working, but trying to deal with appropriate mental health care, you're juggling that. And our first responders should be able to freely say, I'm struggling, but the reality is they can't, because they're worried about their job, they're worried about the stigma, and they're worried about letting their colleagues down because they're already stretched thin. So it's so complex. It'd be easy to say this person is struggling, we'll put them off for 6 months, and that's what should be done. However, is what's the reality of the organization, and how do you find a medium ground so that everybody benefits and can get healthy?
So this year there was a tragedy, in Canada, and this spring, and it really sent a ripple effect throughout the entire world. It affected every single Canadian, I think, to the core, because we were frontline with these people as their families were affected, and I'm speaking about Constable Heidi Stevenson.
Yes.
And this year we honored her as an unsung hero. She was the leader, just like yourself. She wore that same uniform in her role, and I just want to know from you, did you ever know it would be that dangerous? And when you were dealing with those situations, did you know that at any moment you could have put yourself into a situation, or you were that close?
Yes. Yes. It's something that anybody who is in policing deals with on a daily basis. And it's hard for people that don't work in that job to fathom that, I would go to work, I would put on a bulletproof vest, and I would put on my sidearm and kiss my children goodbye and walk out the door. And yes, it's always in the back of your mind. It can be something as simple as pulling up to a gas station and filling up your police car with gas. And in that moment, someone decides they don't like you. We're human, and police officers want to help people. And I honestly believe that the majority of us are really good people that truly want the world to be a better place, and the communities. And yeah, it's not perfect, and we have people that are in policing that should not be there. Period. It's as plain as that. When you have a member who loses their life, for any of us working in this field, it just cuts you in half, because it reminds you that could have been you. And you ask, why her and not me? You go through the events that you've been through, and remember those moments that it was so close that some little thing, it could have been you standing there. So it is cutting, and it's devastating, and we all grieve, and we all remember, and we all wonder why. So it was so sad, and COVID has made it so much more difficult for everybody to try to cope with it. So it really is devastating, and we were contacted by a lot of people that we have worked with, or we've lived all over Canada. We lived in 6 different provinces, just checking in to say, hey, how are you guys doing? We know this is devastating for you as well to see this. So it was a very, very difficult time for us.
So is that possibly one of the steps, is that support system? Would you say that's really important, is just to say, hi, I need some help in this area, and just that visibility to just talk? Is it what helps you get through that process?
Yeah, talking is so important. With my PTSD, when I was at my lowest, I couldn't leave the house. And it was a process where I had to relearn how to integrate back into society. And I started by joining a rock pop choir here in Calgary called Cool Choir. And it was great because I was welcomed by people with open arms. And when they found what I did, and I decided that I would be transparent about my PTSD for my own benefit, what I found was a lot of people wanted to go for coffee, and they wanted to have conversations, and they had stories to tell. And it's those conversations and the talking, and they would say to me, I've never been able to talk to anyone about this. I feel better. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for allowing me to say this, or they would apologize. I've done most talking, they'd say, and I'm like, that's fine. So the talking and reaching out and connecting with people is so important. It is one of the most important things that you can do. And but it's hard to pass the barrier. We judge ourselves, and there's that word weakness again. And in fact, I actually had an individual last year that knew what my previous profession had been, who asked me how you can weed out the weak ones. And I said, what are you talking about? Well, the weak ones, the ones who can't do the job. That was the perception of people that develop PTSD or struggle. So it really shows how deep the stigma is. It explains why we struggle to ask for help, because we still perceive it to be a sign of weakness, and it isn't. And that's part of my big conversation. Asking for help is a sign of strength and courage, to go against what we perceive mental health care to be.
So in your work, we talk about leadership roles, and talking about women, I think, are generally a little bit more open to talking about things, because we need to voice it. We need to get it off our chest. We want to engage with somebody, and I think it's easier for us. Do you find that it's easier for men or women in your experience? You've had many coffee chats lately. Is it women or men or both, or, who's having the conversation now?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because in my household, where my husband also has PTSD, and you're right, it was a very different journey for the two of us. He was much less open to discussing it and wanting people to know that he had it. And we had lots of conversations about that. Well, why would it be different for you than it is for me? And we came up with, yes, it's just the perception that people would perceive him one way and perceive me in a different way. So it depends. And I certainly believe that men have a harder time expressing their emotions. And women, we're lucky, we're allowed. People expect it and we do it, and they tease us about it and we just, move on with it. And sadly enough, for men, they have a whole other set of barriers that they have to pass through. And it shouldn't be like that. I've certainly met men that are able to be open and discuss those feelings, but it is difficult for them. And I think it's important. So my husband and I, we have a blended family of 5 children. 4 of them are men, and we have 1 daughter. And with our children, they're all grown men now, we have really reinforced the idea that men can talk about mental health, and it's healthy, and you need to cry, or you need to be upset, or you need to reach out, and you can't just deal with things on your own. So I think one of the most important things we can do as women who are mothers, grandmothers, aunts, neighbors, it doesn't matter, is help to reinforce for men and young boys. Talking about your emotions and feelings is something that everybody should be doing. It's not just for women, and it's just part of being healthy in general.
So brilliant. I know that that's going to be part of our conversation for 2021 as we welcome men to the conversation as our allies. There are so many things that, they bring to the table to champion for us. This is definitely something as that we are natural nurturers, and we have the ability to shed some light to support them to open up to that side as well. So I think there's some really great conversations that are going to really happen in 2021 that are going to help with that overall mental health and wellness and well-being, so that we can, because life doesn't stop.
No, it doesn't. And I think we can have a huge role with men in teaching them what some of our struggles are. If we don't tell them that there's issues, how do they know? And it's interesting, even something, this came up about 8 weeks ago, where I realized a difference. I will have people ask me what I did, and I tell them I was a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for 25 years. My husband, people will ask him. So when people ask my husband, what did you do? And he tells them, they say, wow, that must have been an interesting career. Or it must have been scary and dangerous at times. Those were always the responses he gets. You know what the response is that I get is, what did you do? That's the response that I get.
My
What
jaw
did
just dropped.
and this, I just connected this because I've never asked him this question before. And he said, they say what to you? And I said, they asked me what I did. And I say, I patrolled in a police car. And oh, they're surprised that that's what I did. So my husband and I were having this conversation, and he's like, wow, so you realize, and I don't think it's it's nothing intentional. People that are asking me that question are also women, so sometimes we're our own worst enemies because our expectations, if I've told someone that I was a member of the RCMP, would they not assume that I was out patrolling like anyone else would be? And this was 8 weeks ago that we were having this conversation. So I think it's important that we speak out about what those differences are, not in a nasty way, but just as an education to say, hey, this is what I'm getting for feedback when I tell people what I did. They're assuming, I don't know, I was a crossing guard or something. I don't know, or I just did school talks, or I don't know what it is. But again, it's probably an unconscious bias, but that's the reality. And so part of encouraging men to talk, it's also encouraging women to share, hey, these are things that are happening. And if you're not sharing it, especially in the workplace, some of those prejudices could be unintentional, people not even realizing that they're doing it, but it's there.
So value added, this conversation here on so many levels.
Well,
Cynthia,
thank you.
Really excited about that because I knew we were going to have a great conversation today. Of course, you and I have had many
Yes.
conversations over the past, 2 years, almost 2
Yeah.
years. It seems like forever,
Yeah.
but it really hasn't been that long. So let me ask you something. So you've got all of this experience, you've worked through your PTSD, and you're still working through that because it's an ongoing process. It just
Right.
you don't all of a sudden disappear. It just,
Right.
you know how to work through it. But what was the moment that you knew that you wanted to take that to the next level? And this is where we talk about the NA, your new transition into that role. You've now just completed your book. So congratulations. So I'd love you to talk about this new journey that you're taking, all of this wisdom and these experiences that are so unique that it would be a shame for you not to share them. And now you have the opportunity to share them and educate people. So let's talk about that.
Sure. And I just want to correct you. My book's not done yet. I'm still working on it. It's still a process, and a slow process. I'm learning about myself as I write my memoir, and it's been a great journey. I think, so what I'm finally realizing is that I do have a lot of experience to share with women, with people in general about mental health, and I would be doing a disservice if I didn't share it. When I was working in the RCMP, I loved serving. I loved serving the community, the public. And when I retired and recognized that I wasn't going to be doing that for a period of time, it was tough. So now when I recognize that people are interested in my stories, that they can learn from my stories, that I can help change things and uplift women and understand where we were, where we're going, and how we're going to get there, to make it easier. Why should people go through something that I've been through when I can give them guidance and advice as to how to make things work better for them? So for myself, continuing to serve in this capacity is so important, and I see wonderful changes. We still have a ways to go. It's not going to happen overnight. But if we don't share our experience, and as women leaders, we don't put ourselves out there, how will the younger generations know that these are things that they can do? And I want to make a difference. I've got 5 grandchildren, both boys and girls, and I want them to see what we can do. So I think that I'm writing, advocating for mental health. I want mental health care to be a right, not an option. I'm speaking and seeing that that's making a difference, and I'm also mentoring women in traditional and non-traditional careers, and all of it, along with all of the women that you have gathered together, Monica, to move us all forward and make society understand that women have so much to contribute, and that by not allowing us to use our voices is that everybody is hurt by it. So I'm really excited about this, and I'm really excited about teaching people that we can do things, and we can do it in a wonderful way that helps everybody to get along and be the best they can be. And it doesn't have to be just on a big stage with 800 people. It can be a one-on-one in coffee. You don't have to be out there if you're not comfortable. There's so many different ways that we can all make a difference. And if by sharing my stories can help people on whatever size stage they want it to help, then when I leave this world, I know that I will have made a difference.
So let's fill in the blanks now for your title. Let's go back to that. We're going to like delete the spaces NA, and we're going to include in here mental health advocate, speaker,
right. Yeah,
mentor,
writer. You're right.
Author. You know, and it's really interesting because I've always said your story does not define you, it empowers you.
Right.
So as people are going through their moments of adversity and deep, dark craziness, you know, I really hope that they can look at and listen to your story and be inspired by, you know, there's a silver lining to that, and it's part of your bigger why. And just to be aware of that piece so that they can help serve others, because everybody has one, everybody has a story, everybody has a purpose, and if we don't share that, you know, we're certainly not going to help somebody else through their journey. So thank you for being so authentic and sharing of your time. I know that that book is taking a lot of time, but I have to say I'm super excited about reading it. I thought it was already done. I keep waiting for it.
No. That's both of us. It's been a journey. It's been a learning journey for me. And again, stepping outside my comfort zone, because I've never done anything like this before. So yes, I am hoping that by the end of 2021, I will be good to go. That is my goal. And just before we close, Monica, I'd really like to say is that I agree with everything you just said. And my diagnosis of PTSD was a gift. It truly was. It taught me about self-care for the first time in my life. I've looked at looking after myself, and I found the joy of music again, and friendships, and connecting, and reaching out to people and helping others. And had I not been diagnosed with it, so for me, it was, you talk about gifts from unexpected places. For me, it was an absolute gift.
Well, thank you for sharing, because I think that's really helpful. I'm sure there's lots of people right now going through some hiccup. I mean, COVID is still, you know, very much a part of our life, and it's changing our lives every day as we speak. But I, like you, am very optimistic about, you know, the future, and about how everything that we experience is leading us to that bigger, grander place where we're stepping into our own voice and our own power together, you know, with men and the women. I just see some beautiful things coming for us all. Before I leave you, I would just like to know, you know, what was your biggest lesson this year going through COVID? What was that biggest lesson?
Big lesson. How much we take for granted. The freedom of movement, the food security, being able to connect with our families and loved ones when we want. We take a lot for granted. And, you know, sitting back and thinking about the circumstances that I find myself in, it was a really good wake up call for how much we have to learn in a society that considers itself really advanced. We really do. And mental health care, you know, it's really brought that to the forefront. And I worry about people, but yet I hope that we can make some big changes because of COVID on the mental health care front, and recognize it is part of being human, and it should be considered just as important as our physical health.
Well, I think stories and conversations like this will definitely, and your book, when it's released, will certainly add value to every single one of those conversations. This is a Woman of Inspiration podcast. So I'm going to ask you, who is that woman of inspiration, or what sort of traits inspire you that you see in other women?
Oh, it's women that lift up other women, women that celebrate their successes and aren't threatened by them. And my sister was my woman of inspiration. As a 17 years older, she was almost like my mom, but still my sister. But she always served and uplifted people, served her communities. She was just a great example for me. So women that uplift other women, for me, I love it. I just think it's wonderful.
And I think that's always really great for our audience to hear. I know there's lots of women that look at all of the things that all of our leaders have accomplished, and there's that imposter syndrome. Am I good enough? You know, I haven't done nearly as many things, but if we take inventory of everything that we've done, and just by impacting one person, the ripple effect is huge.
Oh, it makes a big difference. And that is something that I always speak to. It doesn't matter the stage you perform on, whether it's sitting having a coffee with somebody or you're actually speaking in front of an audience. Everybody can impact other people around them. And everybody, one thing I learned in policing, everybody just wants to know they matter. In the end, that's all they want. Do I matter? You know, if I've made a mistake, if something has gone wrong, will anybody care? And we just all want to know that we matter, no matter what our story looks like. So I completely agree with you, Monica.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to share your story with us today, Cynthia. For those that are listening and watching, how can they get a hold of you, learn more about your journey, follow your journey in anticipation of that book coming out in 2021, and also watch what's going on with our 2021 roadshow, which you're part of the 100 Women of Inspiration book, because there are more conversations to be had.
Yes. So I have a blog site, cynthiahamiltonurquhart.com, and Instagram at cynthia.hamilton.urquhart. As long as you put my long name in there. And Urquhart is spelt Urquhart. Then you won't have any problems finding me.
And I will also be putting that into the show notes for this episode of the Woman of Inspiration podcast. It has been an absolute pleasure, Cynthia. Author, speaker, advocate, mentor. We're going to forget about the NA because you have so much to offer the world, and I'm excited about the journey ahead with you. So thank you very much to all our listeners. If you loved this episode, if it resonated, if you know somebody that has any sort of mental health or is struggling right now, please send them a copy of this podcast and let them know how to get in touch with Cynthia. You know, let them be inspired, listen to the podcast and share it, and keep supporting us here. This is the Woman of Inspiration podcast. My name is Monica Kretschmer, and thank you so much, Cynthia, for such a fabulous interview, and we look forward to the epic journey ahead.
Thank you very much, Monica.